Good day everyone, I am Dave Q. Palermo and I am the assigned presenter for the topic The Causes and Consequence of Inflation. First, I give you the learning objectives. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to identify the main causes of inflation, explain the consequence of inflation, and explain how inflation affects economy of a country. So, first, what is inflation? Inflation is defined as a sustained increase in the prices level or fall of value of money. The increase in the amount of money necessary to obtain the same amount of product or service before the inflated prices was present. It is a social phenomenon where too much money chases to fewer goods and services. Inflation is commonly understood as a situation of substantial and general increase in the level of prices, goods and services in an economy, consequent fall in the value of money over a period of time. So inflation means simply the changes in prices and the down of value of money. So example of inflation today is the inflation in gas, kerosene, and solane, etc. So if we buy a can of sardines today at the price of 20 pesos, in over time passes, the value of the sardines will change due to the inflation. So inflation affects our economy and its people. So it was said that if we buy today goods over time, the value of money we are buying this at the same product, the amount of it will rises. Next, let's move forward to the causes of inflation. First is the demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand is growing at an unstable rate, leading to increased pressure on the scarce resources and a positive output gap. When there is excess demand, producers can raise their prices and achieve their bigger profit margins. Demand pull inflation becomes a threat when a economy has experienced a boom with GDP rising faster than long-run trend growth of potential GDP. Demand pull inflation is likely when there is a full employment of resources and short-run aggregate supply is inelastic. So, when we say the full employment, we are using efficient our resources. So, demand pull inflation means exceeding in the demand. So, the shortage or scare of resources will come. The demand pull inflation will push the inflation because of the scarce resources. The economy usually demands more goods and services than companies are able to produce. So, this supply shortage enables sellers to raise their prices. Also, it is caused by the increase in aggregate demand due to the increase of private and government spending, etc. Let's forward to the main causes of demand pull inflation. A depreciation of exchange rate, increase in the price of imports, and reduce the foreign prices of a country's exports. If consumer buy fewer imports while the exports grow, aggregate demand in will rises, and there is maybe multiplier effect on the level of demand output. So next is higher demand from fiscal stimulus. Example is lower direct indirect taxes or higher government spending. So if direct taxes are reduced, consumers have more disposable income causing demand to rise. Higher government spending and increase in borrowing creates extra demand in the circular flow. Next is monetary stimulus to economy. A fall interest rates may stimulate too much demand. For example, if it is raising demand for loans or lending to house finance inflation, price inflation. Monetarist economists believe that inflation caused by too much money chasing to fewer goods and that governments can lose control inflation if they allow financial system to expand the money supply too quickly. Next is fast growth in other countries, providing a boost to UK exports, example, overseas. Export sales provide an extra flow on income and spending into UK circular flow, so it's happening to the economic cycle of other countries define affects the UK. Demand pull inflation using aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram. Demand pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand grows at an unstable rate leading to a positive output gap. Example is actual gross domestic product or potential gross domestic product. When there is excess in demand, producers can raise their prices and thereby they achieve their bigger profit margins. So like what I had said before, demand pull inflation is most likely when there is full employment of resources there were when aggregate supply is inelastic. So we can see the graph, aggregate supply and aggregate demand. Demand pull inflation is the period which arises from rapid growth. Aggregate demand occurs when economic growth is too fast. So, if aggregate demand rises faster than the productive capacity or long run aggregate supply, then firms will respond by putting up prices, creating inflation. One example of it is the prices of the face mask before and today. Before, 3 pesos is the price of the face mask, but today it is now 5 pesos. So there is an increase due to the demand because of the COVID-19. Let's move forward to the cost push inflation. Occurs when firms respond to rising costs by increasing prices in order to protect their profit margins. Shortage to the available supply of a certain good or product will cause ripple effect through the economy by causing rise prices from the producer to consumer. For example, a sudden decrease in the supply of oil, leading to increase of oil prices, can cause cost push inflation. Producers from whom oil is part of their cost could then pass it to the consumers in the form of increase of prices. Reasons why the cost might rise. First is the component cost. An increase in the prices of raw materials and other components. This might be because of the rise in the commodity prices such as oil, copper, and agricultural products used in their food processing. A recent example has been searched in the world price of wheat. Also example is the pandesal. If we are buying pandesal at the price of 2 pesos, if the ingredients in making pandesal rises, then it will price will also rises. It will maybe 3 pesos per 1 pieces. Next is the rising labor cost caused by wage increase which are greater than improvements in productivity. Wage costs often rise when unemployment is low because skilled workers become scarce. This can drive pay levels higher. Wage might increase when people expect their high inflation so they ask for more pay in order to protect their real incomes. Trade unions may use their bargaining power to bind for a achieve increasing wages. This could be a cause of cost push inflation. So if the laborers demand for high high pay jobs, high pay salaries, so it may cause inflation. The labor groups can example in the Philippines, the labor groups is asking for high jobs. For example is teacher, they are asking for additional pay for the teacher or make the salary of a teacher much higher. They can use their labor force. Also, the next is the expectation of inflation are important in shaping what actually happens to inflation. When people see prices are rising for everyday items, they get concerned about the effects of inflation on their real standard of living. Once of the danger of the pick-up inflation is the Bank of England calls for second-round effects. An initial rise in prices triggers a burst of higher pay claims as workers look to protect their way of life. This is also known as the wage prices effect. Next is higher indirect taxes. For example, is a rise of duty on alcohol, fuel, cigarettes, or a rise of value-added tax. Depending on the price elasticity of demand and supply for their products, suppliers may choose to pass on the burden to the tax into consumers. So, today, I think the higher cigarette prices will Marlboro. So, they pass, before, we all know that prices of cigarette is 30 or for one case, but now it is now 60 or more than that. Next is a fall in the exchange rate. This can cost push inflation because it leads to an increase in the prices of imported products such as essential raw materials, components, and finished products. So it is also affect the inflation. The imported products used to make a finished product here is being becoming higher, so the cost will affect the prices of the finished products. Next is the monopoly employers profit push inflation, where dominant firms in a market use their market power, whatever level of demand, to increase prices well than cost. So the demand for a finished product, if there is one producer, they can make it higher, maybe if the demand is too much or it is less. So let's move forward to the cost push inflation using a aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram. Cost push inflation occurs when the firms respond to rising costs by increasing their prices to protect their profit margins. Because of rising labor cost, higher prices for imports, components, raw materials, a deception of exchange rate causing rise of import cost, and increase in the business taxes. Example is the value-added tax, environment taxes such as carbon tax. So it the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, causing higher price level and lower real GDP. Cost push inflation occurs when we experience rising prices due to higher cost of production and higher cost of raw materials. Cost push inflation is determined by supply side factors such as higher wages and higher oil prices. Also, cost push inflation can lead to lower economic growth and often causes fall of living standards through often proves that to be temporary. So, as we can see, the real GDP or the growth of our GDP is slow. So, because of the higher expenses in making productions. So, the tendency is to the rise of prices. Now, there are types of inflation. One types of inflation is open inflation. The countries are rise level visible in the naked eye. One can see the annual rate of increase in the price level. So, nakikita natin yung pag-increase ng prices. Next is the galloping inflation. Very rapid inflation in which almost impossible to reduce. Sabi sa nabasa ko dyan, the inflation rises 10%, the economy becomes unstable of the government leaders can lose credibility. So, sobrang bilis ng pagtaas ng mga prices. So, next is the repressed inflation. There is excess in demand. The excess in demand is prevented from increasing the price level by some expensive measures. Kunyari, katulad no sa pork, sa supply ng pork sa Luzon. So, tumaas masyado ang prices. Then, the government expensive measures is, halimbawa nito ay, they make price control. So, the DTI make price control for the 380 to 250 pesos per kilo of the meat pork. Next is the hyperinflation. The price level goes rising at the very fast rate. Often happens hourly increase in the price level. It often leads to demonetization. In hyperinflation, general prices of goods and services increases, meaning the real value of currency loses or decreases. Next is the creeping inflation. The price level increases very slowly over a period of time. Next is the moderate inflation. The rise of price level, it's neither too fast or nor too slow. Let's move forward to the economic and social consequence of inflation. First is the income redistribution. One risk of higher inflation is that has a regressive effect on lower income families and older people in the society. This happens when prices of food and domestic utilities such as water and healthing rises and a rapid rate. Next is falling real incomes. With millions of people facing a cut in fewer wages or at best pay freeze, rising inflation leads to a fall of real incomes. Next is negative real income interest rates. If interest rates on saving accounts are lower than the rate of inflation, then people who rely on interest from their saving will be poorer. Real interest rates for millions of savers in the UK and many other countries has been negative for at least 4 years. Next is cost borrowing. High inflation may also lead to higher borrowing costs for business and people needing loans and mortgages as financial markets protect themselves against rising prices and increase the cost of borrowing on shorting a longer-term debt. There is also a pressure of the unemployment benefits and other welfare payments as the cost of living climbs higher. Next is risk wage inflation. High inflation can help to increase in pay claims as people look to protect their real incomes. This can lead to a rise of unit labor costs and lower profits for business. Next is business competitiveness. If one country has much higher rate inflation than others for a considerable period of time, this will make its export less prices competitive in the world markets. Eventually, this may show through the reduction of exports orders, lower profits, and fewer jobs. Also, in a worsening of a country trade balance. A fail in exports can trigger a negative multiplier and the accelerator effect on national income and employment. Next is business uncertainty. A high volatile inflation is not good for business confidence, partly because they cannot be sure of what their costs and prices are likely to be. This uncertainty might lead to lower level of capital investments and spending. So, who are the potential winners from rising inflation? First is the workers with strong wage bargaining power, perhaps those who belong to strong trade unions. They can protect their real incomes by bidding for higher wages. Next is the debtors. If real interest rates on loans are negative, then the real value of debt may fall. Also, the producers, if the prices rise faster than the cost, leading to higher profits margins. Wealthy groups, if there are sustained period of asset prices of inflation. Example is the stocks and property. And then, who are the potential losers from rising inflation? First is the retired people on fixed incomes. Inflation cuts the real value of their pensions and other savings. Also, the lenders, if real interest rates on loans are negative, Servers if real returns on commercial bank deposits are negative. Workers with low paid jobs with little bargaining power. Those in the gig economy with no union to protect. Next is exporting firms may lose sales of profits if they become less competitive, eventually hitting the shareholders. In conclusion, inflation arises from general level of prices of goods and services in economy over a period of time. Inflation results from excess aggregate demand over aggregate supply or the demand pull inflation. Also, the cost push inflation due to the high cost of productivity, resulting from the slow growth or slow GDP that cause a rise of the prices. In order to protect the business establishment profit margins, they have to raise their prices. Overall, it affects the workers and business establishment. Workers' salaries or wages is affected by inflation. Also, the business establishments, the capitalists will also affect by this inflation. That's all for my report. I hope you learned. Thank you.